I can see you. Can you see me then?
Hola, John.
Hola.
I can see you perfectly well.
Okay.
So it seems
Well,
you're also in London, right?
I am almost certainly in London.
Okay, we're neighbors now.
Yes.
We moved to the other side of the world.
I was sort of thinking about where I would have wanted to have spent the last 4 months, because I've been holed up in the same space for 4 months now.
Well, I've been more than 6 or 7 or 8. I don't know. No hope to move, though.
No hope at all in my case. What a fascinating conversation you two were having.
Well, we are the masters of improvisation, it seems, right?
It's a really strange thing that happens, and I'm sure you went through this, where you spend hours reflecting on what you might want to say, and then you come into this conversation via this room. It's like a kind of sci-fi zone, which seems to basically suck everything that you were thinking of saying out of your head. So I'm trying to figure out where I might want to start the conversation with you now, given the fact that I've been rearranged a little bit.
Well, actually, to be honest, I didn't really have a lot of time to think about what to say, because I just surrendered to the idea of improvisation.
Okay.
And honestly, I've been, dealing with, I'm a professor, so I'm trying to set up all these online courses and trying to engage, to try to create about how do you deal with remoteness,
yes,
creating proximity or a sense of proximity via these digital devices. So I've been very busy doing that. But I was very curious about your work, because you've been working on diaspora and film and art. And at the end of the day, it's also about a storytelling representation. And with all what is going on, and I think the conversation about racial capitalism and kind of the different crises and debates that are around, I think I was very curious and very happy to know a little bit more about your work.
I mean, I suppose part of what's interesting for me about what I'm trying to do recently is in the concept of proximity that you just introduced. I'm very attached to the idea of proximity. I'm attached to the idea of trying to engineer relations of proximity between narratives and histories, ideas and figures. So that's very important, a sort of starting point really for all that I kind of do. And I think part of the moral and aesthetic attachment to the question of proximity is almost like a sort of a rehearsal in the work of a way that I might want to be in life. That if I can persuade otherwise unfriendly agents, should we say,
I like how you call them.
Fragments of narratives which are all insisting on their sovereignty and uniqueness and, ontological separateness, blah, 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 etc., etc. If you can persuade a provisional détente in which some agreement is arrived at, between them for a conversation, then that might have some bearing on your life, it might have.
But that's interesting, because somehow it connects with something that I've been kind of working and thinking a lot for many years, and somehow the idea of storytelling is also a device of persuasion. And I work in urban planning and urban design, and somehow, I've been thinking a lot and working with participatory processes, but at the end of the day, it's a constant negotiation, and it's how do you deal and engage with persuasion to allow proximity, co-inhabitants. But I wonder how this moment of the pandemic and this idea of proximity that has been kind of banned from our lives.
Yes.
How is changing, your work? Because if it's so central for what you do, I don't know if it's altering how you consider that, or how that is impacting in the way you...
No, absolutely. I think once you become fixated or have this idea fixed on something, you start seeing it everywhere,
But you are an artist, and if you are not obsessed, you are not an artist.
Thank you. But
that's
you know
a
what
compliment.
I mean?
That's a compliment. Yes, no, totally.
But the sense you get this, at a certain point, I suddenly realized that I was speaking to people who kept saying to me, oh, what is it like to live in this pandemic? And actually, at a certain point, you realize that you're living multiple pandemics, that there was there's something about the sort of perpetual threat of a kind of narco-political order, which always seems to have at the end of it a kind of death, which hangs over Black life. You find yourself suddenly thinking of it in pandemic terms. You think, oh, what if this is also a pandemic? So there's a sense in which part of what I've been trying to grapple with in the work that I've been doing is to see whether I can force a kind of proximity between certainly the two recognizably visible pandemics in my life, or the pandemics that I recognize as having some purchase, if you will.
And how many are you recognizing?
I think beyond that, you start to also realize that, of course, they alert you to others, don't they? Because, I have, for instance, I had a show in San Francisco, which was canceled, and then it was brought back on. And the curator who reintroduced it wrote to me about a week ago saying, oh, I'm standing here in a space where the air is suddenly become very thin to breathe, So you think, oh, wow, okay, so that's another pandemic, There are whole layers of these narratives of emergence. Negative emergence, these are not great things.
Well, you call it unfriendly agents.
Yes, absolutely.
But also this idea of the breathing, breathing that is always so central in many traditions and meditation, but also the breathing as, the Fanonian terms of the right to breathe.
Yes, yes, of course. God, I hadn't even thought about that one.
And also connected with all the mess that is going around regarding police brutality, and frankly, all the racial injustice that is so blunt that is not longer deniable.
Yes, no, absolutely. It's funny when you mentioned Fanon, one of the things I wanted to ask you was which thinkers were helping you to walk in the present, which thinkers were allowing you to not necessarily make sense, because there isn't a huge amount of it that makes sense at present. But who are you fellow traveling with at the moment?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea, because, for instance, these days I was reading James Baldwin, Dark Days. This is something that you read in just with one coffee, right?
Right. Okay, I'll buy it.
So good. And Bell Hooks.
Okay.
Because she says that poetry, is central for us. And I think what helped me throughout the beginning of the lockdown here, that I was totally disconnected from everyone, and as a good migrant, I was away from anyone else. It was not necessarily thinkers, but poets, and it was kind of poetry and writing haikus what helped me kind of to navigate a bit the moment of more crucial uncertainty. Not that we don't have uncertainty now, but that was kind of still when kind of the brain and the body was kind of getting used to understanding that we are going to be changing the course of our lives, at least for a little while. And I work in urban planning and urban design, and I think it's coming from these kind of Western ideas that future exists and that you can predict it, and that, you know, that's what I've been taught and what I teach. And now I'm really, so I've been reading a lot about futurability and these things, but now I'm very conflicted about understanding time itself. And even if we can define that is a post-pandemic. I mean, I was recently, yesterday, holding a workshop with a lot of institutional partners in one of my projects from UN Habitat, the Platform or Right to the City, all these people that work in urban issues. And we were doing a workshop about imagining the post-pandemic, like the cities in the post-pandemic. But then we ended up discussing that, is it such a thing as post-pandemic? So in other words, what is the ability we have now to think about future? And to what extent then we have to just to remain within the realms of what is present? But if you are talking with people that deal with the states, regulatory frameworks, budgets, you know, the world of urban policy, how cannot engage with future? So I'm living in this, I'm in this threshold of trusting and kind of fueling hope to trust that we are gonna imagine collectively a better future, but at the same time struggling to really visualize this idea of what is lying ahead of us, because we are just trying to keep together what we are, also due to mental health. Thinking way beyond it's painful.
I mean, I'm hoping that there might be a plural in our thinking about the future, that there might be post-pandemic futures or lack of futures, you know. So it feels to me as if there are post-pandemic possibilities of exploring how to live in the future, not with the disappearance of something, but its perpetual presence. There's certainly that, but there's a way in which, you know, I think the present has altered a kind of phantom, you know, because when you're a sort of hyphen figure, you know, diasporic figure, there's a way in which, you know, you feel stalked by this thing which remains forever hidden in shadows, and claims that it doesn't exist. Whiteness, for instance. Exactly. Says, oh, no, there's no such thing. You know, it hides, it masks itself in a kind of enlightenment window dressing.
Yeah,
right?
It's a willful ignorance as well.
Yeah, but those categories of reason and liberty and fraternity, you know, are, you know, there are moments when you feel as if they're masks in your life, because they sound horrible, you know, they sound, and then we have this aha moment when you think, you know, there it is, almost like a kind of Moby Dick-like apparition. There it is, you know. There's a moment when that, you know, man was being killed in the 8 minutes 42 seconds, when I think like almost all of us universally and unanimously thought, okay, there it is. This is it. You know, we can see it. And I'm hoping that unmasking of this authority means that it doesn't have a future.
But it's interesting the very idea of the mask, because James Baldwin uses the white mask guilt. Fanon talks also about the mask. So I think the mask is a powerful metaphor.
It is.
And maybe the mask could help us to understand kind of that threshold between the present and the future ability that we want to build. And I've been reading a lot of pluriversal politics.
Oh, wow.
Arturo Escobar. He's from Colombia.
Okay.
He works in anthropology, the colonial thought, design. So I think I'm very, very interested in understanding or getting around this idea of pluriversality, because it allows what you were saying in terms of the multiplicity of futures or no futures.
Absolutely.
And I think understanding that, and that connects with what I was talking to. So if you sell the narrative of the American dream, for instance, you are shadowing all the multiplicity of ways of being or understanding existence. And I think we need to be, I mean, we are in a moment in history that certainly we need to think in the plurality of the terms.
Absolutely. I mean, I was forcefully reminded of that question of pluralism when you were talking to, the last speaker about slavery, and and he made the very correct observation that one of the ways in which it came to an end was, at least in England, was that the owners of the enslaved were paid in England and weren't in the United States. And I think the pluriversalist possibilities of that idea in the present might be that you pay both the enslaved as well as the slavers, because it wouldn't be fair now. It wasn't fair then, but then now I think if you were to offer it as a model, it wouldn't be, the ethical outcome might not be to just pay, quote unquote, those who are the owners, because those who are the owners have inflicted multiple damage on communities, for instance. What do we say to...
Exactly, and that's the whole movement of reparations.
Indeed.
And you cannot disconnect reparations from abolition, and abolition from extractivism.
Absolutely. But I mean, that's what I'm saying, that for me, what it would mean, a pluriversalist reparations based present on, let's say, buying out the oil companies wouldn't just be about giving money to them, but also all the other, if you lived in Alaska in the 80s and 90s, it's quite likely that the oil spill from the Exxon Valdez had made facets of your life really not worth living, diseases or whatever, your livelihood and so on, and these attendant narratives can't just be wished away if you decide to buy out the oil companies.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm coming from Colombia.
Exactly.
We have many wounds, but one of them is that if you are, I don't know, in the north part of the country, with many extractivist coal industries are damaging the ecosystem, killing and supporting, illegal groups. I mean, there's a lot of death and violence that go with it.
Yeah.
And I think the unspoken violence that is attached to extractivism, it needs to be revealed. And I think something that the colonial debate allow us to think through is also in terms of what has been called the colonial wound. And therefore the healing needs to be, it's paired with the reparation as well, I feel.
No, absolutely.
So I think it's a very complex, and it operates in a very symbolic term. So I think the paying off and the how much, I don't get it, because I don't work on that. But you work in the symbolic realm, right? And the narratives and the representations of it, how to make appear, and how do you even represent those masks that need to be revealed?
Yeah. I mean, part of it for me, and I really love that phrase, the colonial wound, because of course, in a kind of pluriversalist discourse, one would be looking for different kinds of wounds, because the assumption when people hear wound is they think people, for instance, and quite a lot of what has to be repaired isn't just about human, life and community and livelihoods. I mean, we're sharing spaces in which, a certain kind of precarity really is the quality of life for other species in those spaces, and I'm very keen that all the discussions, and so that's partly why I work the way that I do. I'm very keen that we bring other ontologies onto the table in this discussion about reparations and abolition, that we don't, in the act of reconsidering alternative narratives, reconstruct the hierarchy, in which we sit at the apex of something and are therefore the most important, our problems being the most urgent, and everything else is like, well, I can wait.
Exactly.
We sort out our starvation and our lack of water, and then we'll deal with the elephants and other later, because
then and that's part of what the interspecies dialogues is coming, and the post-human element of the debates is also
no, absolutely. But it's, I think the reasons why those conversations are important for me in terms of moving image work is that it allows you the possibilities for reconceptualizing and rethinking what story means, what narratives are, what combinations of forms are, and what the ends of storytelling is, because if it's simply to continue to rewrite the Aristotelian premise that all stories exist merely, to show how human beings overcome adversity, then I'm afraid I'm not that interested anymore.
Absolutely.
I'm not interested in that kind of story anymore. And it's increasingly my dissatisfaction with most cinema, for instance, or television. It just doesn't really seem to me to address this question of what stories are for now, other than serving human kind of, or species arrogance, or what's the word I was looking for?
I don't know if banality, because somehow now, when you were talking about moving images, what is in a way the infoxification, I think is the word.
Yes.
And all the moving image that we are surrounded with every moment that we, open our telephone. Is that the stories that we are getting bombarded, and the moving image that we get is pretty much part of the evil or the Anne friends?
I'm not sure that I don't disagree with you at all, actually. I think part of, sorry.
So I don't know this, the social media and all the multiple new avenues to produce so easily, quickly, and spread around these moving images and telling stories, to what ends at the end is serving, and how can we kind of dismantle all these infrastructures that are in a way expanding the banality of existence.
Yeah. What's interesting for me about stories now was that in contrast to what they appeared to me as when I was younger, and I still love stories, even the ones that I disagree with profoundly, I still love them. But the difference between those and now is that my innocent assumption that stories had to be exclusively and almost wholly about, human entities in the frame just doesn't hold that interest for me anymore. So you watch, let's say, a film, and two people are standing in a desert talking, and the film tells you that nothing around them matters, just them. In fact, everything around them is only there to show you how well or not so well they're going to do. right? And the idea that anything around them, the cactus plants, or might be themselves involved in some drama of their own, doesn't occur to most mainstream narratives at all anymore. It didn't before, it certainly doesn't now, you know. And so there's a way in which a kind of willful blindness seems to be a necessary prerequisite for accepting most mainstream narratives, and that worries me more and more, you know.
Right. And I think there's a really interesting concept that comes, I mean, also from Arturo Escobar, from a Colombian sociologist called Falsborda, that is called sentipensante, or feeling thinking. And it's a very interesting concept because it's about the connection between body feelings, but also the collective love for the territory. And this idea of territory, of the extended, you know, landscape all around, as kind of the unity and the connection with it, is a very important part of the ontology of many of the indigenous communities and Afro-Colombian communities that live in the water. So I think this idea of the sentipensante, that is, you cannot talk about from this logocentric perspective,
right,
but for a more emotional and connected with the surroundings, I think a more enriching and a more attuned to what we need to move towards this love towards earth that we were speaking.
Say that phrase again. It's so wonderful. Say it again.
I don't know what I cannot repeat.
What did you call it?
Oh yeah, sentipensante. That's the word.
Sentipensante.
So it's like feeling thinking. It could be a rough translation, but I think that that's a very interesting idea because it connects collectivity and affection for the environment and all its creatures. So it's a more encompassing way of also thinking stories, I guess. And
no, I liked it a lot because it reminds me of a phrase that an anthropologist and ethnographer came up with. His name's Stephen Feld, and he came up with this idea of acoustemology, a way of knowing one's environment through sound, as opposed to always knowing it through images. And it sounds a little bit like that, you know.
Yeah. So you perhaps, because I'm reading all the Latin American, Silvia Rivera does a lot of the colonial critique of all the ocular centrism of Western ideas of knowing.
Indeed.
So I think that's like very interesting ideas to keep exploring about.
You know, you just made me have this regret again. I did Spanish, you know, as a kind of O level and A level, and then I slowly just let it go. it's like a central fucking regret of my life.
No, well, this is in English. All this is in English already, so.
Okay. But it would have been wonderful to have read them in Spanish. You know, it would have been just.
I am hardly getting into the English, so.
My God, 30 minutes is already gone.
It's gone. You see. So now it's time for you to tell to the next guest what you were preparing, because we didn't have time to talk about what you were preparing to.
Oh, wow. Yeah. No, I'm happy to do that. It was just, as I said, as I sat in the chamber listening to the two of you, just about everything I thought I was going to say just went. It literally all just went. And so I wanted to come on and try and engage more with what you two had been talking about, you know. Well, and I'm glad I did that, because otherwise...
yeah, it was a lovely conversation in any case, and now I look forward to see your work in reality.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, hopefully.
And I hope to speak soon somewhere, somehow.
It's a very strange way of meeting somebody, isn't it?
It is, but it is what it is, so we will have to take it. Other ways of proximity are possible now.
Indeed.
Have a lovely night. Ciao.